The rhythmic clatter of the R6-A subway car was the heartbeat of the city, a mechanical pulse that millions of New Yorkers tuned out by necessity. It was 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the peak of the morning rush, where humanity was compressed into a suffocating intimacy of wool coats, damp umbrellas, and the pervasive, metallic scent of ozone and stale coffee. The train, a silver serpent slithering through the bowels of Manhattan, was currently suspended in the dark void between 34th Street and Times Square, a stretch of track where the darkness seemed to press against the scratched plexiglass windows with a physical weight. Inside, the atmosphere was one of collective disassociation. Eyes were glued to glowing smartphone screens, ears were plugged with noise-canceling buds, and minds were already projecting themselves into office cubicles and meeting rooms. No one noticed the slight, almost imperceptible deceleration that defied the automated schedule. It began not with a scream, but with the lights. The harsh, clinical fluorescence that bathed the commuters in a sickly pallor flickered once, twice, and then died completely. For a heartbeat, the car was plunged into absolute, abyssal blackness, the kind of dark that exists only deep underground where the sun is a myth. Then, the emergency lighting kicked in, a dim, amber glow that transformed the mundane carriage into a sepia-toned tableau of confusion. The train shuddered violently, the screech of steel on steel piercing the air like a banshee's wail, throwing standing passengers off balance. Briefcases slid across the linoleum. Bodies collided in a domino effect of startled grunts and apologies. The train ground to a halt, not at a platform, but in the middle of the tunnel, surrounded by the dripping, ancient concrete of the city's infrastructure. Silence usually followed such halts, a tentative quiet where passengers waited for the conductor's crackling voice to announce train traffic ahead. But today, the silence was heavy, thick with a sudden, inexplicable pressure. The air conditioning systems whined and powered down, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the settling of the car's suspension. From the connecting doors, at both ends of Car 4, the shadows detached themselves from the darkness of the tunnel. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that betrayed military precision, distinct from the frantic shuffling of the commuters. There were 4 of them in this specific car, though the operation spanned the entire train. They were clad in matte black tactical gear, devoid of insignia, their faces obscured by high-tech ballistic masks that reflected the amber emergency lights like the eyes of insects. In their hands, they held suppressed carbines, held low but ready, the barrels scanning the terrified crowd with robotic efficiency. There was no shouting. The Hollywood trope of the screaming gunman was absent here. This was a silent takeover, terrifying in its discipline. One of the figures, towering and broad-shouldered, raised a gloved hand. He held a device that emitted a high-frequency pulse, a mobile jammer that instantly severed the digital lifelines of every person in the car. Phones that had been displaying social media feeds or drafting emails suddenly went dead, searching futilely for a signal that had been strangled. The realization rippled through the crowd like a cold wave. This was not a delay. This was not a malfunction. A woman in a beige trench coat, seated near the door, began to hyperventilate, the sound sharp and ragged in the stillness. The towering figure approached her, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak. He simply placed a gloved finger to the mask where his lips would be, a universal gesture of silence executed with the menacing aura of an executioner. The threat was implicit and absolute. The woman clamped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Her eyes wide with the primal realization of entrapment. The leader of this cell, a man whose mask bore a faint, white scratch across the left cheek, moved to the center of the car. He reached up and tapped a small device adhered to the ceiling speaker system. A voice, synthesized and distorted to remove any trace of gender or accent, echoed not just in Car 4, but throughout the entire train, vibrating through the bones of the trapped hostages. You are currently 300 feet below the surface. The third rail has been neutralized. The tunnels fore and aft are rigged with shaped charges capable of collapsing the ceiling and burying this train under 1,000 tons of bedrock. Remain seated. Remain silent. Your lives are now a currency. Do not devalue yourselves. The message was a cold splash of reality. The panic that had been bubbling beneath the surface threatened to erupt, but the presence of the gunmen, standing like statues at the exits, stifled it into a trembling terror. The train had become a sealed capsule, an iron sarcophagus buried beneath the metropolis. Above ground, the city was waking up to the chaos, but down here, time seemed to warp. The air began to grow warm and stale as the ventilation remained off. The leader walked the length of the aisle, his boots making no sound on the grime-streaked floor. He was assessing the livestock. He looked not at their faces, but at their demeanor, identifying the threats, the hysterics, and the calm ones. He stopped in front of a young man in a business suit who was gripping his briefcase with white-knuckled intensity. The gunman reached out and gently removed the briefcase from the man's hands, setting it on the floor and sliding it away. The message was clear: you own nothing here. Not your property, not your time, not your life. The complexity of the operation was evident in the equipment they carried. These were not desperate amateurs looking for a quick score. They had drilling equipment strapped to their backs, compact and industrial. They had gas masks hanging from their belts, suggesting they were prepared for chemical escalation. They had planned for the darkness, for the claustrophobia, for the psychological disintegration of their captives. In the conductor's cab at the front of the train, the true horror of the situation had already played out. The driver, a veteran of 20 years, sat bound and gagged, his eyes fixed on the surveillance monitors that now showed only static. Standing over him was the architect of this nightmare. He was unmasked, unlike his soldiers, confident that no camera was recording his face. He was a man of indeterminate age, with features that were forgettable in their blandness, the kind of face one would pass on the street 1,000 times without registering. He watched the tunnel ahead through the front window, staring into the gloom where the tracks converged. He checked his watch, a mechanical chronograph that ticked in sync with the plane. 8:20 a.m. The police would be receiving the call right about now. The demand was simple on paper: $500 million in untraceable cryptocurrency and a flight out of JFK, a classic ransom. A cliché, that was the point. The demand had to be loud, absurd, and focused enough to draw the entire gaze of the NYPD, the FBI, and the media to the surface, to the negotiation, to the impossible logistics of the transfer. He smiled, a humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. Let them surround the stations. Let them cordon off the blocks from 34th to 42nd. Let them bring in the SWAT teams and the hostage negotiators with their megaphones and their psychological profiles. They would be looking at the train as a static object, a vault to be cracked open. They didn't know about the spur. Decades ago, during the Cold War paranoia, the city had commissioned secret infrastructure projects, bunkers, evacuation routes, and connecting tunnels meant for the elite in case of nuclear annihilation. Most were documented, some were filled in, but one, a maintenance spur known in the forgotten blueprints as the arterial cut, intersected with this specific section of the track. It was sealed behind a false concrete wall just 50 yards ahead of the train's current position. It was a ghost tunnel, a void in the data. The architect keyed his radio, a closed-circuit frequency that bounced off the tunnel walls. Phase 1 complete. The city is holding its breath. Prepare the breach. Back in car 4, the air was getting heavier. The collective fear was a palpable miasma, smelling of sweat and expensive perfume turning sour. A baby began to cry in the next car, the sound muffled by the heavy doors, but piercing enough to shred the nerves of everyone listening. One of the gunmen tilted his head, listening to the cry, then resumed his statue-like vigil. The indifference was more terrifying than cruelty. It suggested that the passengers were not people to be managed, but obstacles to be navigated. The train sat motionless in the dark artery of New York, a metallic beast swallowed by the earth. The passengers, stripped of their agency and their connection to the world above, sat in the amber gloom, waiting for a salvation that felt light years away. They were trapped in the belly of the city, and the digestion process had just begun. 300 feet above the silent train, the city of New York was convulsing. The initial distress call, routed through the transit authorities' heavily encrypted emergency channel. had triggered a cascading failure of the morning routine that rippled outward from Midtown Manhattan like a shockwave. Times Square, usually a chaotic mosaic of tourists and costumed buskers, had been transformed within minutes into a militarized zone. The flashing red and blue lights of the NYPD cruisers reflected endlessly off the massive digital billboards, creating a surreal, strobe-lit canyon where the faces of fashion models and news anchors looked down upon a scene of rapidly organized panic. Barricades were erected with frantic speed at 42nd Street and 7th Avenue. The yellow police tape, flimsy and fluttering in the wind, marked the boundary between the frantic curiosity of the public and the grim professionalism of the responders. SWAT teams, encased in heavy armor that made them look more like machines than men, moved in phalanxes toward the subway entrances, their movements sharp and practiced. But they stopped at the turnstiles. The orders were clear: absolute containment, no entry. The threat of the tunnel collapse was not a bluff. Sensors placed by the terrorists had already detected the vibrations of the first responders' boots, triggering a warning light on the dashboard of the hijacked train below. The city was held at bay by the threat of gravity itself. In the mobile command center, a repurposed gargantuan truck parked awkwardly on the sidewalk of Broadway. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and high-stakes tension. Detective Elias Thorne stood before a wall of monitors, his face a landscape of deep lines and weary cynicism. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning the pulse of the city, but this rhythm was unfamiliar. It was an arrhythmia. Next to him stood Special Agent Miller of the FBI, a man whose tailored suit and manicured appearance clashed with Thorne's rumpled raincoat. They were staring at a digital schematic of the subway grid, a complex web of veins and arteries that represented the lifeblood of the metropolis. The schematic showed the train as a blinking red rectangle, frozen in the black void between stations. To Miller, it was a tactical problem, a geometry equation to be solved with force and negotiation. To Thorne, it felt like a stage play. The demand for $500 million in cryptocurrency had arrived via a secure server in the Cayman Islands 10 minutes ago. It was too clean, too standard. Thorne watched the blinking red light, his eyes narrowing. The amount was high, but not impossible. The escape demand was the problem. A flight from JFK. It was a suicide run. No one leaves a surrounded airport. These men were professionals. The precision of the takeover proved that. So, why was the exit strategy so amateurish? Thorne traced a finger over the digital map. The tunnel where the train sat was a straight shot, a concrete tube with nowhere to go but forward to the station filled with snipers, or backward to the station filled with the National Guard. It was a kill box. Why would a sophisticated crew lock themselves in a coffin? Unless the coffin had a back door that wasn't on the map. Below the surface, the dynamic was shifting from shock to a terrified curiosity. The amber emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows against the curved walls of the subway car. The architect, still in the conductor's cab, monitored the surface response on a tablet that was hardwired into the tunnel's abandoned telecommunications line, another secret of the Cold War infrastructure that the city had forgotten. He watched the police perimeter tighten, watched the snipers take positions on the rooftops. It was exactly as he had choreographed it. They were looking up, watching the vents, watching the exits. They were looking at the glass ant farm, expecting the ants to try and climb out the top. He signaled to the team in car 4. The time for theatrics was over. The time for excavation had begun. The large man who had silenced the weeping woman earlier now moved to the rear of the car. He unslung the heavy industrial pack from his shoulders. It wasn't a weapon. It was a compact, high-torque thermal lance setup, flanked by sound-dampening baffles. Two other operatives moved to the side of the train facing the tunnel wall, the side opposite the third rail, the side that faced nothing but grime-encrusted concrete. Or so the passengers thought. The operatives unfolded a heavy, black tarp, holding it up like a curtain to shield the passengers' eyes from the work. But the sounds could not be hidden. A low, intense hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound distinct from the subway's usual mechanical groans. It was the sound of concentrated energy eating through matter. The smell of ozone intensified, mixing with the scent of melting rock and ancient dust. A young man sitting near the window, an architecture student named Leo who had missed his stop due to the delay, peered through the gap between the seats. He saw the flash of blue-white light behind the black curtain, a light so intense it bleached the color from the surrounding air. They weren't setting explosives. They were cutting. But cutting what? The tunnel walls were feet thick, backed by bedrock and the crushing weight of the city. There was nothing behind them but earth and worms. Leo's mind raced, pulling up the mental maps of the city's underground he had studied for his thesis on urban decay. He knew about the aqueducts, the steam tunnels, the forgotten stations. But this section of the track was supposed to be solid. Yet, the operatives worked with the confidence of men opening a door, not digging a hole. The thermal lance hissed, a sound like 1,000 snakes, and a section of the tunnel wall, a perfect rectangle 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, began to glow cherry red. The heat radiated into the car, causing sweat to bead on the foreheads of the hostages. The operatives worked with surgical precision, cooling the edges with a chemical spray that turned to steam instantly. They were cutting a portal. Suddenly, the rectangular slab of concrete shifted. It didn't fall inward onto the tracks. It fell outward, away from the train, into a darkness that shouldn't have existed. A draft of cold, stale air, smelling of dry rot and standing water, rushed into the subway tunnel, swirling the dust and debris. The architect walked back from the cab. Stepping into car 4, he looked at the gaping hole in the reality of the subway tunnel. Beyond the cut lay a void, a tunnel much older than the one they were in, brick-lined and arched, dripping with the condensation of decades of neglect. This was the arterial cut. He turned to the hostages, his face exposed and calm, a terrifying contrast to the masks of his soldiers. He spoke softly, yet his voice carried in the sudden silence that followed the breach. "The police believe you are the leverage," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the terrified commuters. "They believe we are negotiating for money, but money is just data, and data is easily deleted. What we need is time, and you ... He gestured to the dark tunnel he had just opened. You are the burden that will buy it for us." He pointed to the architecture student, Leo, and 6 others nearby. "You 7, stand up. You are going to help us move the equipment. The rest of you, pray that the police upstairs are as patient as they claim to be." As Leo stood up, his legs trembling, he looked into the abyss of the new tunnel. He realized with a sinking heart that the train wasn't the prison. The train was just the waiting room. The real nightmare was waiting in the darkness of the forgotten city, a labyrinth where no GPS signal could reach and no SWAT team would ever think to look. The heist wasn't about escaping the subway. It was about disappearing into the earth itself. The transition from the stalled R6 to a carriage to the void beyond the cut was a passage through time. Leo stepped over the jagged, molten lip of the concrete breach, his dress shoes slipping on the debris, the heavy battery pack strapped to his back digging into his shoulders. He left behind the amber-lit modernity of the subway car world of plastic advertisements and vinyl seats and entered a space that felt like the throat of a dying beast. The arterial cut was not built with the utilitarian brutalism of the modern subway. It was an artifact of a different era, constructed from weeping red brick and hand-hewn granite, the ceiling arching high into a gloom that the tactical flashlights could barely penetrate. The air here was significantly colder, dropping 10 degrees in the span of a single step. It smelled of wet earth, rusting iron, and something organic and decaying, a scent that triggered a primal recoil in the brain. The floor was uneven, covered in a thick sludge of silt and oil that had accumulated over 50 years of silence. As the 7 chosen hostages trudged forward, their breathing ragged and loud in the acoustically dead space, the beam of a terrorist's light swept across the wall. It revealed a faded, peeling sign painted directly onto the brick, "Shelter Sector 4, authorized personnel only 19:6 to." Behind them, the breach in the tunnel wall glowed like a furnace door. The architect stood at the threshold, a silhouette framed by the dying light of the subway car. He was not coming yet. He was orchestrating the final illusion. Inside the train, The remaining passengers, over 40 souls, sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the remaining gunmen who were now setting up tripods in the aisle. These were not cameras, but motion-sensing turrets, automated sentries wired to the train's electrical grid. The message was clear to those left behind: move, and the machine reacts. The architect keyed a sequence into a console strapped to the chest of the dead pilot's seat in the conductor's cab. He was looping the audio feed to the police listening devices that were surely being drilled into the tunnel ceiling from the street above. The train would sound alive. The whimpers, the shifting of bodies, the occasional cough, all recorded in the last 30 minutes and now set to play on a randomizing loop. A digital ghost ship, populated by echoes, drifting in the static dot back on the surface. The sun had fully risen, casting long, sharp shadows through the canyons of Manhattan. But the mood in the mobile command center was gray and suffocating. Detective Thorne was pacing the length of the trailer, a caged animal instinct twitching beneath his skin. The negotiation channel had been silent for 12 minutes. In a hostage crisis, silence was usually a prelude to violence. "We have a thermal variance," a technician announced, her voice tight. She pointed to a spectral monitor displaying a heat map of the street and the earth below. "Sector 7, right above the train. The heat signature is diffusing." Special Agent Miller leaned in, bracing his hands on the console. "Diffusing? Is the AC back on?" "No, sir," the technician replied, frowning. "It looks like ... ventilation. Heat is bleeding out of the tunnel, but not through the street grates. It's moving laterally? West." Thorne stopped pacing. "West? There's nothing west but foundation walls and the old aqueduct lines. Those are sealed, unless they aren't," Thorne muttered, grabbing his radio. "Miller, they aren't waiting for the crypto. They're moving. That silence isn't a negotiation tactic. It's a head start." Miller looked skeptical, his faith in the blueprint of the city absolute. "We have seismic sensors on the tracks, Thorne. If that train moves an inch, we know. If they try to blow a wall, we feel it." "We felt nothing but the background vibration of the city. They didn't blow it," Thorne said, his eyes unfocused as he visualized the underground. "They cut it. Thermal lances, low vibration, high heat. That explains the diffusion." He turned to the tactical commander. "Get a team to the basement of the Baxter building on 8th Avenue. If they are moving west through old infrastructure, they have to cross the basement line, deep underground." The procession of captives and captors moved deeper into the arterial cut. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, descending past the usual depth of the subway system, down into the bedrock foundation of the island. The sound of their footsteps changed from a wet slap to a hollow echo. The light from the subway breach had vanished around a bend, plunging them into a world illuminated only by the harsh, dancing cones of the tactical lights. Leo struggled to keep his footing. The man in front of him, an older stockbroker whose expensive suit was now ruined by sludge, stumbled and fell to his knees, gasping for air. A gunman was on him instantly, not with a blow, but with a helping hand that gripped the man's bicep with the force of a hydraulic clamp, hauling him upright. The cruelty was gone, replaced by a terrifying necessity. They needed the mules to carry the gear. The equipment was heavy drills, batteries, and metallic canisters marked with hazard symbols that Leo couldn't identify. The architect caught up with the group, his movements unhurried. He walked past the struggling hostages to the front of the column. He stopped at a heavy iron blast door, rusted shut and welded by time. It looked impenetrable, a monolithic slab of metal sealing off the past. He didn't use explosives. He didn't use the thermal lance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a physical key, a heavy, brass object with complex, antique teething. It was a skeleton key for a city that no longer existed. He inserted it into the keyhole, which had been packed with grease to prevent rusting, likely years ago. With a groan of protest that sounded like a dying wail, the internal tumbler shifted. The heavy iron wheel on the door turned as the door swung open. A rush of air hit them, not the stale, wet air of the tunnel, but dry, cool air. The beam of the flashlights revealed a space that made Leo stop dead in his tracks. Forgetting the gun at his back, They weren't just in a tunnel anymore. They had entered a station. But it wasn't on any map Leo had ever seen. The walls were tiled in pristine white ceramic, untouched by graffiti. Crystal chandeliers, thick with dust but unbroken, hung from a vaulted ceiling. It was a private station, an opulent, secret stop built for the titans of industry during the Roaring Twenties, mothballed and forgotten during the Great Depression. The Roosevelt Spur, a myth among urban explorers, a ghost story told by track workers. And sitting on the single set of tracks in this secret station was not a subway car. It was a maintenance locomotive, painted in matte black, its engine humming with a low, electric purr. It had been waiting. The architect turned to the group, his voice echoing in the vast, tiled cathedral. "Welcome to the real underground," he said. "The train you were on was a cage. This is the vein, and we are the virus entering the bloodstream." He signaled for the hostages to load the equipment onto the flatbed of the maintenance locomotive. As Leo heaved the heavy battery pack onto the metal deck, he saw the architect looking at a digital map on his tablet. The blinking blue dot of their location was moving away from the red chaos of the police perimeter. They weren't just escaping, they were traveling beneath the unsuspecting millions, moving toward a destination that was likely hidden in plain sight. Above, the city screamed with sirens, focusing all its rage and resources on a stationary metal box filled with terrified decoys and recorded whimpers, while the true threat slipped silently through the cracks of history, riding a black train into the deep, dark unknown. The electric locomotive did not glide. It prowled, unlike the commuter trains above, designed for passenger comfort and synchronized stops. This maintenance beast was a flatbed of raw, utilitarian steel, driven by a high-torque engine that vibrated through the marrow of everyone aboard. The 7 hostages huddled on the cold metal deck, surrounded by the ominous shapes of the drilling equipment and the silent, masked figures of their captors. There were no seats, no handrails, only the terrifying proximity of the tunnel walls, rushing past at 40 miles per hour, a blur of soot-stained brick and dripping conduit that felt close enough to tear the skin off an exposed arm. Leo, the architecture student, sat with his knees pulled to his chest, the vibration of the deck rattling his teeth. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to orient himself, but the darkness was disorienting. However, the air told a story. The dry, preserved atmosphere of the Roosevelt Spur station had vanished, replaced by a heavy, saline dampness that coated the back of his throat with the taste of brine and rust. The temperature had plummeted further. He opened his eyes and looked up at the tunnel ceiling as a service light flashed by. The brick archways were gone. In their place were segmented, cast iron rings, bolted together with rivets the size of fists. A cold realization settled in Leo's stomach, heavier than the fear. These were shield-driven tunnels, the kind used for subaqueous excavation in the late 19th century. They weren't just underground, they were underwater. The pressure in his ears popped, confirming the descent. They were crossing the East River, but not via the L train or the Queens Midtown Tunnel. They were utilizing a forgotten pneumatic tube or a pilot tunnel never expanded for public transit. They were driving a ghost train beneath millions of tons of river water, suspended in a rusted iron straw in the mud of the riverbed. In the small, cage-like cab of the locomotive, the architect watched the depth gauge. The needle hovered at a critical mark. He knew exactly where they were, directly beneath the swirling currents of the East River, roughly aligned with 30th Street. The city's infrastructure was a layer cake of history, and he was eating through the bottom crust. He glanced at the digital timer strapped to his wrist. 9:05 a.m. On the surface, the illusion was holding, but the cracks were showing. Detective Thorne stood in the basement of the Baxter Building, a cavernous space filled with the hissing of steam pipes and the groan of the building's boilers. He was 3 levels down, yet he felt miles away from the truth. The tactical team he had brought with him swept the room with flashlights, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. Seismic sensors are flat. Detective, a tech officer reported, checking a handheld device. If they're drilling, they stopped. Thorne ignored him, pressing his hand against the cold concrete of the foundation wall. He closed his eyes, tuning out the ambient noise of the boiler room. He was listening for a rhythm, a heartbeat that didn't belong to the building. He felt it, a faint, rhythmic shudder, more of a vibration in the solace of his feet than a sound. It was consistent, mechanical, and it was moving away. They aren't drilling, Thorne whispered, his eyes snapping open. They're traveling. The thermal variance wasn't a vent. It was the heat signature of a breach being left behind. He grabbed his radio, his voice sparking with renewed urgency. Miller, get the harbor unit on the line. I want sonar sweeps of the riverbed, specifically the old alignments south of the Queensboro Bridge. They're under the water. Under the water. Miller's voice crackled back, incredulous. Thorne, the transit tunnels are sealed. There's no train that runs those lines. Not a transit train. Thorne snapped, moving toward the stairs. A workhorse. We're chasing a ghost, Miller. Seal the ventilation shafts on the Queen's side. If they come up in Long Island City, back in the iron tube. The locomotive began to decelerate. The screech of the brakes was deafening in the confined space, sparking showers of orange fire that illuminated the terrified faces of the hostages. The train drifted to a halt in a widening of the tunnel, a cylindrical chamber that looked like the inside of a massive submarine. The air here was thick with humidity, water dripping steadily from the ceiling, pooling around the rusted tracks. The architect stepped out of the cab, his boots splashing in the oily water. He gestured to the wall on the right. It wasn't concrete or iron. It was a massive, circular bulkhead door, resembling the hatch of a bank vault mixed with a submarine airlock. A wheel, 3 feet in diameter, sat in the center, coated in a thick layer of grease. Above it, a brass plaque read, NY Pneumatic Transfer Hub 71912. End of the line, the architect announced, his voice devoid of emotion. Everyone off. The gunmen prodded the hostages off the flatbed. The stockbroker, whose breathing had become a ragged wheeze, collapsed onto the wet ground. One of the terrorists loomed over him, but the architect raised a hand. Leave him. He's dead weight now. The rest of you, bring the canisters. Leo grabbed one of the heavy silver canisters. It was surprisingly cold to the touch. As he lifted it, he saw the label printed on the side in small, stenciled letters. C4 plasticized detonator, military grade. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just an escape. They hadn't brought drilling equipment to get out. They had brought demolition charges to get in. The architect approached the bulkhead door. He didn't use a key this time. He pulled a small, complex electronic device from his vest, stripping the wires from a junction box next to the door. He was bypassing the century-old mechanical locks with a digital override. Sparks flew as he connected the leads. You think this is about a ransom, the architect said, not to his men, but to the hostages, as if compelled to confess his brilliance to the audience he was about to destroy. You think we want $500 million. That is small thinking. That is surface thinking. The heavy gears inside the bulkhead groaned, a sound of metal screaming against metal. The wheel began to turn on its own, driven by the bypassed hydraulic actuators. We are currently 60 feet below the bedrock of the East River, the architect continued, watching the wheel spin. Directly above us, buried in the silt, are the fiber optic trunk lines that connect the New York Stock Exchange to the global servers in London and Frankfurt. The milliseconds of data that flow through those cables are worth trillions, not millions. The door swung open with a rush of stale, pressurized air. Beyond it lay not another tunnel, but a maintenance crawl space, a narrow throat leading upward, lined with thick, black cables that pulsed with the invisible wealth of the world. We aren't here to steal the money, the architect said, stepping into the crawl space. We are here to sever the connection, and when the market goes blind for 10 minutes, we will own the fluctuation. Leo stared at the black cables. This was financial terrorism on a geological scale. They were going to blow the internet backbone of the financial world, creating a chaos they had likely already shorted on the global markets. The ransom was a distraction. The train was a decoy. The real weapon was the silence they were about to inflict on the world's economy. Move, a gunman barked, shoving Leo toward the hole. Unless you want to be here when the river comes in to fill the void. Leo realized then that the explosives weren't just for the cables. They were to blow the tunnel roof. Once they were gone, the East River would crush this chamber, erasing all evidence, all fingerprints, and all witnesses in a torrent of black water. The crawl space above the pneumatic hub was a claustrophobic throat of concrete and steel, barely 4 feet in diameter. It ascended vertically, a chimney rising toward the riverbed, lined not with soot, but with the pulsing arteries of the global economy. Thick, armored bundles of fiber-optic cables, black and slick as python coils, ran in parallel lines up the shaft. To the uninitiated, they looked like standard industrial wiring. To the architect, and now to Leo, they represented the physical manifestation of abstract power. Inside those glass strands, light pulses were trading futures, crashing currencies, and shifting national debts at the speed of thought. Leo climbed the rusting rungs of the service ladder, his hands trembling. The air here was hot, charged with the electromagnetic static of the massive data throughput. The hum was physical, a vibration that tickled the fillings in his teeth. Below him, the other hostages struggled upward, prodded by the barrels of suppressed carbines. The canister of C4 strapped to Leo's back felt heavier with every rung, a dead weight promising oblivion. They reached a service platform, a steel grating suspended in the darkness of the shaft. This was the junction point. Here, the cables were exposed, stripped of their heavy external casing for maintenance access. The architect stepped onto the grating, his demeanor shifting from that of a commander to that of a surgeon. He opened a heavy aluminum case carried by one of his operatives. It didn't contain weapons. It contained delicate splicing tools and a ruggedized laptop. "Secure the charges," the architect ordered, his voice barely rising above the hum of the cables. The operatives moved with practiced efficiency. They took the silver canisters from the hostages. Leo surrendered his with a gasp of relief and began molding the blue-gray putty around the central cable bundles. They weren't just placing explosives. They were shaping them. Shaped charges, designed to cut, not just to shatter. They were performing a lobotomy on the city. Meanwhile, 300 feet above and 2 miles south, the illusion at 34th Street was shattering. The NYPD Emergency Service Unit SU had reached their limit. The silence from the train had stretched too long. The negotiation had stalled. The decision had been made. At a synchronized signal, 12 tactical teams breached the subway tunnel from the emergency exits at 34th and 42nd Streets. Flashbangs detonated in the tunnel darkness, turning the subterranean world into a blinding white strobe. "Police, get down, hands!" The screams of the officers echoed off the tunnel walls as they swarmed the stalled train. They smashed the windows, weapons raised, adrenaline pumping at lethal levels, but there was no resistance. There was no return fire. As the smoke from the flashbangs cleared, the lead officer lowered his rifle, confused. The train car was empty. The seats were vacant. The luggage was there: briefcases, backpacks, purses scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a rapture. But the people were gone. Suddenly, the speakers crackled. A woman's sob echoed through the car, followed by a man's desperate plea for water. The officers spun around, aiming at the empty air. It was the recording. The audio loop, clear. "The car is clear." The shout went down the line, panic rising in the voices of the rescuers. "It's a ghost train. They're gone." In the conductor's cab, the lead ESU officer found the pilot's body and the tablet rigged to the console. He saw the wire running from the tablet to the tunnel's communication line. He ripped the tablet free, severing the connection. The weeping voices stopped instantly, replaced by the heavy, accusatory silence of the empty tunnel. "Command," the officer whispered into his radio, his voice shaking. "We've been played. The train is empty. Repeat, the train is empty." In the mobile command center, Detective Thorne slammed his fist onto the console, cracking the plastic casing. "I told you," he roared, turning on Agent Miller. "They didn't want the airport. They wanted the infrastructure." Thorne grabbed the radio handset, bypassing protocol. "Harbor unit? This is Thorne. I need a hard perimeter on the East River. Sector 4-9. You sonar. Look for bubbles. Look for heat. Look for anything that doesn't look like mud. They are under the water." Back in the cable shaft, the architect finished typing a command into his laptop. He wasn't just destroying the cables. He was injecting a delay. A logic bomb that would freeze the automatic trading algorithms of the major banks for exactly 12 seconds before the physical severance occurred. In high-frequency trading, 12 seconds was an eternity. It was enough time for his preset short positions to execute before the market went dark. He closed the laptop and looked at the charges. The timers were set. 10 minutes. The police have taken the train, the architect announced calmly, checking his watch. The decoy has served its purpose. Now, the river becomes our ally. He turned to Leo and the other hostages, who were huddled against the damp wall of the shaft. The architect's eyes were cold behind the mask, but for a moment, he pulled the fabric down, revealing a mouth set in a grim line. "You have been useful," he said. "History requires witnesses, but survival requires silence." He gestured to the ladder continuing upward. "Climb. The hatch at the top leads to a storm drain outfall on the Queen's side. It is low tide. You might make it." Leo looked at the ladder, then at the charges ticking down. 10 minutes. To climb 100 feet of rusted iron, navigate a storm drain, and escape before the river crashed in. "What about you?" Leo asked, a foolish bravery seizing him. The architect smirked. "We do not take the stairs." He pressed a button on the wall of the shaft. A heavy, hydraulic hiss filled the air. A section of the shaft wall slid back, revealing a small, cylindrical airlock. Inside sat a submersible delivery vehicle SDV, a miniature. Wet sub used by Navy SEALs, painted matte black. It was their extraction. They weren't going up to the street. They were going out into the river, under the keel of the searching police boats, vanishing into the murk of the harbor. "Go," the architect commanded, raising his weapon. "Run. The water is coming." Leo scrambled onto the ladder, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He began to climb, the other hostages following in a frantic, desperate chain. Below them, the red LEDs of the C4 timers blinked in the darkness. 9:59, 9:58. They were racing not just against the explosion, but against the Atlantic Ocean itself. The latter was a rusted spinal cord running up the inside of a concrete throat. Leo scrambled upward, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps that tasted of iron and panic. Above him, the faint gray light of the storm drain filtered down, a beacon of a world that seemed a lifetime away. Below him, the red digital eyes of the detonator counted down the remaining seconds of their existence. For 22. For colon to 1. The shaft was narrow, designed for maintenance workers in protective gear, not for a terrified group of civilians in office wear. The metal rungs were slick with condensation and decades of grime. Every slip of a foot, every scrape of a shoe, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the chain of climbers. The woman in the trench coat, climbing directly above Leo, was sobbing quietly, a continuous, hitching sound that echoed off the wet walls. Leo reached up and swatted her ankle, a desperate, non-verbal command to keep moving. There was no time for comfort. The air pressure in the shaft felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders, the weight of the East River waiting to reclaim its space. Far below, in the chamber they had just fled, the architect finalized his departure. The airlock hissed as it filled with river water, the dark, murky liquid rising to equalize the pressure. He sat in the pilot's seat of the SDV, the submersible delivery vehicle, checking the instrument panel. The cockpit was illuminated by the soft green glow of the navigation array. Beside him, his second-in-command secured the hatch. They were sealed in a bullet of titanium and composite materials. The architect triggered the release. The outer doors of the submerged tube opened, and the East River rushed in to meet them. It was a silent, violent embrace. The SDV didn't shoot out. It slid out, a shadow detaching itself from the mud. The thrusters engaged with a low hum, barely audible over the rush of the current. They were now ghosts in the machine of the harbor, running dark, drifting with the tidal flow to mask their heat signature. On the surface, the chaos had mutated. Detective Thorne stood on the pier at Hunters Point South Park in Long Island City, the wind whipping his raincoat around his legs. He held a pair of high-powered binoculars, scanning the gray, choppy surface of the river. The police radio on his shoulder was a cacophony of confusion units clearing the empty train. bomb squads searching for secondary devices, traffic control trying to unsnarl the gridlock. Thorne, we have a sonar anomaly. The harbor unit commander's voice crackled in his ear. Sector 4, something detached from the riverbed. It's moving fast. South-southeast. Intercept it. Thorne screamed into the mic. Drop depth charges if you have to. That's them. We can't just drop charges in the harbor, detective. There's civilian traffic. Ferries ... then ram them. Do not let that shadow reach the ocean. Thorne lowered the binoculars, his eyes scanning the shoreline. If the terrorists were in the water, where were the hostages? The architect didn't kill without purpose. The hostages were courtesy, or they were distractions, and then he saw it. A plume of steam rising from a storm grate near the old sugar refinery, 100 yards down the pier. It wasn't steam from a pipe. It was the condensation of frantic human breath meeting the cold air. "Ems to my location," Thorne yelled, sprinting toward the refinery. "I have movement at the outflow." Back in the shaft, Leo's hand struck metal. A heavy, iron grate blocked the path to the sky. He pushed against it, his muscles screaming, but it didn't budge. It was wrested shut, sealed by the indifference of the city. "It won't open," he screamed, his voice cracking. The panic in the shaft spiked. The climber below him grabbed his leg, pulling him down in a frenzy of terror. 01:30. Leo jammed his shoulder against the iron bars, pushing with every ounce of hysterical strength he possessed. He looked through the grate. He could see the sky. He could see the jagged skyline of Queens. He could see a seagull flying lazily overhead. It was right there. "Help!" he screamed, the word tearing his throat. "Help us!" Thorne heard the faint, muffled cry rising from the pavement. He dropped to his knees beside the heavy storm grate, peering into the darkness. He saw a pale face, eyes wide with terror, pressing against the bars. "Hang on," Thorne shouted, grabbing the grate with both hands. He pulled, his veins bulging in his neck, but the iron was fused to the concrete frame. "I need a pry bar, now." An officer from a patrol car ran up, sliding a heavy crowbar across the pavement. Thorne jammed the tip into the seam of the grate. "Everyone back," he ordered the gathering officers. "Heave." Below, Leo watched the sparks fly as the crowbar bit into the metal. The digital numbers on the detonator below were burning into his retinas. Even though he couldn't see them anymore, he could feel the time running out. The air in the shaft seemed to vibrate, a low-frequency hum building up from the depths. 00:15. "Come on," Thorne roared, throwing his entire body weight against the bar. With a sound like a gunshot, the rusted bolt snapped. The grate lifted 6 inches. "Push," Thorne yelled at the face in the darkness. Leo shoved the grate upward, scrambling out onto the wet asphalt. He didn't stand up. He rolled, scraping his skin raw, gasping for the sweet, cold air. He turned back, reaching down to grab the hand of the woman in the trench coat. "Pull her," Leo screamed at the cops. "Pull them all. The water is coming." Thorne and 2 other officers grabbed the woman's arms, hauling her out of the hole like a ragdoll. Then came a young man, then another. They were pulling bodies out of the earth as fast as they could. 00:03. The last hostage, a middle-aged man, was halfway out of the hole when the world ended. It wasn't a fire. It was a concussive thud, deep and resonant, like the earth's heart skipping a beat. The ground beneath their feet jumped 6 inches. The sound was muffled, coming from deep underwater, but the pressure wave was instant. A geyser of black water, mud, and debris erupted from the storm drain, shooting 50 feet into the air. It caught the last hostage, throwing him and the officers holding him backward across the pavement. The force of the explosion traveled up the shaft, transforming the tunnel into a cannon barrel. The East River, unleashed by the shattered bulkhead below, surged into the void. The suction was catastrophic. The water didn't just fill the tunnel, it hammered it. The implosion collapsed the riverbed. Thorne lay on his back, covered in slime and river muck, his ears ringing. He watched the black water recede from the geyser, falling back onto the street like toxic rain. He rolled over, coughing, looking at the gaping hole where the grate had been. It was now a swirling vortex of water, sucking air and debris down into the drowning dark. He looked at the survivors, huddled and shivering on the concrete. 5 of them. 2 were missing, swallowed by the physics of the blast or left behind in the dark. Thorne stood up, wiping the mud from his eyes. He looked out at the river. The water was churning violently, a massive whirlpool forming near the center of the channel where the tunnel roof had given way. The architect had severed the line. The connection was broken, and somewhere under that chaotic surface, a black submersible was slipping away into the Atlantic, leaving a city brought to its knees by a ghost. The whirlpool in the East River did not last long, but its psychological scar was permanent. The physical violence of the implosion, the geyser of silt, the cracked pavement in Queens, the shudder that registered on seismographs as far away as Jersey City was merely the overture. The true devastation was silent, invisible, and traveling at the speed of light. As the dust settled on the pier at Hunter's Point, Detective Thorne stood watching the black water churn. The immediate crisis of life and death had passed, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization of failure. Medics were attending to the 5 survivors, wrapping them in silver thermal blankets that crinkled in the wind like static. They were shell-shocked, covered in the grime of the city's bowels, their eyes wide and unseeing. Thorne didn't approach them yet. He was listening to the radio, but the chatter had changed. The frantic screams of the tactical teams had been replaced by a confused, rising murmur from a different channel. The Federal Tier Command, "This is Air 1, we have a visual on the river disturbance. No debris field consistent with the vessel. It looks like the riverbed just collapsed." Thorne looked at his phone. It was dead, not out of battery, but out of service. He looked around. The officers were tapping their screens, shaking their heads. The cellular network was jamming, overloaded not by call volume, but by a sudden, catastrophic data void. 3 miles south, in the windowless, climate-controlled fortress of a data center in New Jersey, the true bomb had just detonated. The fiber-optic trunk lines that the architect had severed were not merely cables. They were the optic nerves of the global financial body. When the C4 sheared through the glass fibers, the connection between the New York Stock Exchange and the high-frequency trading servers in London and Frankfurt didn't just stop, it screamed, for 12 seconds. An eternity in the world of algorithmic trading where microseconds equate to millions of dollars. The market flew blind. The automated bots that controlled 80% of global trades were programmed to react to latency. When the signal died, they panicked. Algorithms designed to mitigate risk interpreted the silence a catastrophic liquidity event. They triggered immediate, cascading sell orders. It was a flash crash of historic proportions. On the floor of the NYSE, the screens didn't flicker. They simply turned a wall of red. Billions of dollars in market capitalization evaporated in the time it took Thorne to wipe the mud from his face. The nervous system the architect had spoken of was now seizing. In the mobile command center, Special Agent Miller was screaming into a hardline phone, the only piece of technology still reliable. "What do you mean dark? How can the whole grid be dark?" He slammed the receiver down and looked at Thorne, who had just entered the trailer, dripping wet and looking like a man who had seen the devil. "It's not just the tunnel," Miller said, his voice trembling with a rare lack of composure. "The explosion severed the transatlantic trunk lines. The redundant systems are failing to pick up the load. The market is in free fall. They just halted trading on the NASDAQ." The architect. He didn't just steal money. He turned off the lights. Thorne walked to the map of the harbor. He ignored the financial apocalypse. That was a problem for bankers and politicians. His problem was a black needle moving in a black haystack. "Where is the sub?" Thorne asked quietly. "We have sonar buoys in the water," Miller replied, distracted. "The Coast Guard has a cutter moving to intercept at the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge. If they try to leave the harbor, we'll hear them." "He won't leave," Thorne said, tracing a finger along the coastline of Brooklyn. "Not yet. The ocean is too big to open. He needs a transition point, a place to discard the shell." Beneath the surface of the upper bay, the architect piloted the SDV with the calm of a man taking a Sunday drive. The submersible was designed for this, hugging the bottom, drifting with the silt clouds to confuse active sonar. The explosion had created a massive acoustic shadow, a chaotic wall of sound that blinded the sensors of the searching police boats. To the hydrophones above, the harbor sounded like a rock crusher. The hum of the SDV's electric motor was lost in the noise. Inside the cramped cockpit, the architect watched a different screen. It wasn't a navigation chart, but a satellite feed of the global markets. He saw the red line plunging vertically. He saw the chaos. A thin smile touched his lips. The sharp positions his group had leveraged across dispersed, untraceable accounts in Singapore and Dubai were currently appreciating at a rate of $10 million per second. Phase 2 is complete, he said to his pilot. The city is blind. Navigate to the graveyard. The pilot nodded, adjusting the trim. They weren't heading for the open ocean. They were banking hard to the left, toward the rotting, industrial shoreline of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, specifically, toward a submerged dry dock that had been flooded and abandoned since the 1970s. Above the water, the sun was high and bright, a cruel contrast to the darkness unfolding below. The NYPD harbor unit's boats were cutting white wakes across the gray water, their crew scanning the surface with desperate intensity. Helicopters chopped the air overhead, their downdraft whipping the waves. But they were looking for a surface breach, a periscope, a bubble trail. Thorne, back in the command center, felt a nagging itch in his brain. The safe exit was the ocean. But the architect was not safe. He was arrogant. He wanted to watch the fire he lit. Thorne looked at the map again. The Narrows were the choke point, the obvious trap. If Thorne were the architect, he wouldn't run the gauntlet. He would go to ground, get me the schematics for the coastal industrial zones. Thorne barked at a tech. Specifically, anything with deep water access that's currently listed as derelict. Detective, there are hundreds of sites like that, the tech replied, overwhelmed. The Gowanus, the Navy Yard, Red Hook ... filter by depth. Thorne ordered. The sub needs at least 30 feet of draft to stay submerged and hidden. And look for heat, not in the water, but on the land. A waiting vehicle, a warm engine in a cold zone, the tech typed furiously. A moment later, a blip appeared on the satellite thermal overlay. I have a heat signature in a condemned warehouse at the edge of the Navy Yard. Stationary. Engine idling. It's been there for 20 minutes. Thorne grabbed his jacket. That's the extraction. He's not swimming to Europe. He's taking an Uber. Miller. Thorne shouted. Redirect the choppers. Sector 8. The Navy Yard. We catch him when he comes up for air. The net was tightening, but the architect was already surfacing. The SDV glided into the gloom of the flooded dry dock, rising slowly through the oily water inside the covered structure. The canopy of the warehouse concealed them from the sky. The sub broke the surface with a gentle splash, the only sound in the cavernous, pigeon-infested ruin. The hatch popped open. The smell of the river was replaced by the smell of dead pigeons and diesel. The architect climbed out, stepping onto the rotting concrete walkway. A black van was waiting, its engine purring softly. He checked his watch. The city was paralyzed. The police were looking at the ocean, and he was standing on dry land, a ghost in the machine, with the wealth of a small nation secured in the cloud. But, as he reached for the door of the van, a sound cut through the air, not a siren, but the distinct, rhythmic thwup 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 of a rotor blade banking hard and low. Thorne had guessed right. But guessing right and arriving in time were two very different things. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was a graveyard of American industry, a sprawling 300 docker carcass of rusting cranes, dry docks filled with black water, and brickware houses that stood like tombstones against the gray sky. It was a place of ghosts, where the skeletons of battleships had once been forged, but now it served as the stage for a modern war. The silence of the derelict shipyard was shattered not by the clang of hammers, but by the screaming turbine of an NYPD Bell 429 helicopter banking hard over the East River. Inside the warehouse at Dry Dock 4, the sound of the rotor blades beat against the corrugated metal roof like a giant, frantic heart. The architect paused with his hand on the door handle of the black Mercedes Sprinter van. The vehicle was armored, a mobile fortress with run-flat tires and reinforced glass, but against air support, it was merely a coffin. He looked at the pilot of the submersible, who was now scrambling into the driver's seat of the van, panic widening his eyes. We are burned, the pilot hissed, the engine roaring to life. "They are right on top of us." The architect did not panic. Panic was a failure of imagination. He had anticipated a 50% probability of interception at the extraction point. He slid into the passenger seat, pulling a tablet from his tactical vest. The screen showed a tactical grid of the Navy Yard, linked to a series of remote relays he had planted days ago. The police were reacting to a crime. He was playing a strategy game. "Drive," the architect ordered. "Route Bravo. The main gate is compromised." We go through the crushing yard. The van peeled out of the warehouse, tires screaming on the slick, pigeon-slicked concrete. As they burst into the daylight, the world turned blindingly white. The helicopter's searchlight, a focus beam of millions of candelas, slammed onto the hood of the van, pinning them against the backdrop of rusting iron. Dust and debris swirled in the violent downdraft. "NYPD, stop the vehicle." The amplified voice from the sky boomed, vibrating in the architect's chest. The driver floored the accelerator. The van surged forward, its reinforced bumper smashing through a chain-link fence as if it were spun sugar. They careened into the alleyways of the industrial park, a maze of shipping containers and stacked steel beams. Detective Thorne was on the ground, his unmarked sedan fishtailing as he drifted around the corner of Flushing Avenue, entering the yard through a service breach the tactical teams had just cut. He saw the helicopter dipping low over the container stacks, marking the target. Thorne slammed his radio against the dashboard, blocked the Sands Street exit. He roared, "Do not let them reach the BQE. If they get on the highway, we lose them in traffic." Thorne's car engine whined in protest as he pushed it to redline, navigating the obstacle course of the shipyard. He wasn't just chasing a criminal. He was chasing the man who had just severed the aorta of the global economy. The stakes made his hands shake on the wheel. He saw the black van ahead, weaving between two massive gantry cranes. It was moving with a terrifying, heavy momentum. Inside the van, the architect watched the pursuit on his tablet. Blue icons were swarming the perimeter. He tapped a command on the screen. "Activate Asset 4. Ahead of them. A massive pile of scrap metal crushed cars and twisted rebar was held in place by a magnetic crane that had been out of order for weeks. The architect had hacked its control unit days prior. As the first pursuing police cruiser, its sirens wailing, closed the gap behind the van, the architect executed the command. The electromagnet on the crane, 40 feet above the road, suddenly cut power. Tons of jagged, rusted metal rained down onto the roadway directly behind the van. The crash was earth-shattering, a cacophony of tearing metal and smashing glass. The lead police cruiser slammed on its brakes, drifting sideways and slamming into the wall of debris, instantly cutting off the direct pursuit. "Clear," the driver shouted, adrenaline making his voice crack. "Not yet," the architect replied, his eyes scanning the sky. The helicopter was still there, a persistent predatory bird. "We need to clip the wings." The van drifted around a corner, entering a long, straight causeway lined with old brick factories. At the far end, a police barricade was forming, 3 cruisers parked bumper to bumper, officers taking cover behind their doors, weapons drawn, ramming speed. The driver asked, gripping the wheel. "No," the architect said. "Stop." The driver slammed the brakes. The van screeched to a halt 50 yards from the barricade. The sudden stillness was jarring. The officers at the barricade hesitated, fingers tightening on their triggers. "Why stop?" The architect opened the sunroof of the van. He didn't stand up. He simply tossed a small, cylindrical object out onto the asphalt. It rolled a few feet and stopped. It looked like a smoke grenade. "Reverse," the architect said calmly. Hard, as the van shot backward, tires smoking, the cylinder didn't release smoke. It released a high-intensity stroboscopic flare, mixed with a deafening acoustic charge, a sound cannon burst designed for riot control, but modified for lethal decibels. The flash was blinding, searing the retinas of the officers at the barricade, while the sound wave hit them like a physical hammer, shattering the windows of the police cruisers and dropping the officers to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. Thorne, approaching from a side street, saw the flash and felt the concussion vibrate through his car's chassis. He cursed, swerving to avoid the disoriented officers. The van had used the distraction to J turn into a narrow service tunnel that ran beneath the dry docks, a tunnel that wasn't on the standard maps. He's going underground again, Thorne shouted into his headset. He's heading for the old steam tunnels under Building 77. The architect's van disappeared into the dark maw of the tunnel entrance. The darkness swallowed them, offering a brief respite from the eye of the helicopter. But the architect knew this was the end of the line for the vehicle. The tunnel dead-ended at the waterfront, at a location that offered no exit for a car. "Stop here," the architect commanded as they reached the center of the tunnel. "Get the bags. We move on foot." The driver and the two other operatives piled out, grabbing the waterproof duffel bags filled with hard drives and backup servers, the proof of their transaction, the keys to the billions they had stolen. The architect stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked at the van. It had served its purpose. He reached inside and armed a localized thermite charge on the dashboard. It wouldn't explode. It would burn. It would melt the engine block, the chassis, and any forensic evidence left inside into a glowing puddle of slag. "The police think we are trapped," the architect said, his voice echoing in the damp tunnel. "They think this is a dead end." He walked to a rusted metal panel on the wall, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others. He pressed his hand against it. It wasn't a panel. It was a door, concealed by decades of grime. It swung open to reveal a narrow spiral staircase leading down. "Where does this go?" the driver asked, looking at the abyss. "To the intake valves," the architect said. "We aren't going to the street. We are going back to the water." But not in a sub. Above them, Thorne and a SWAT team were advancing into the tunnel, shields raised, tactical lights cutting the gloom. They saw the abandoned van, the heat from the thermite already beginning to distort the air around it. "Contact," Thorne yelled. "Van is stationary. Move up." But as they approached, they found only the melting vehicle and an empty tunnel. Thorne kicked the tire of the burning van in frustration. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping the walls. He saw the open panel, the dark spiral staircase. "He's running out of room," Thorne growled, checking his weapon. "He's going into the intakes. He's trying to flush himself out into the river." Thorne looked at his team. "We go down, and watch your step. If he blows the valves while we're inside, we drown in seconds." The architect was dragging them into the circulatory system of the Navy Yard, a place of high-pressure pipes and freezing water, where one wrong turn meant death by drowning or hypothermia. The concrete labyrinth had become a vertical descent into hell. The spiral staircase was a rusted helix drilling down into the bowels of the Navy Yard, vibrating with the subterranean thunder of the city's water table. Thorne descended first, his weapon mounted with a tactical light that sliced through the gloom, revealing walls slick with century-old condensation and mineral buildup that looked like weeping sores on the concrete. The air grew colder with every revolution, heavy with the metallic tang of treated water and the rot of the river. This was the Brooklyn Navy Yard's forgotten circulatory system, the high-pressure intake facility designed to flood dry docks in minutes. A place of massive forces and zero forgiveness. At the bottom, the staircase terminated onto a narrow, grayed catwalk suspended over a vast, cylindrical chamber. Below, black water churned violently, fed by massive pipes that disappeared into the darkness of the walls. The noise was deafening, a constant, crushing roar of millions of gallons of water moving under extreme pressure. It drowned out footsteps, breath, and even the shouting of orders. Communication was reduced to hand signals and the primal instinct of the hunt. Thorne signaled his team to spread out. The SWAT officers moved like shadows, their boots gripping the wet grating, their eyes scanning the tangled machinery of valves, pistons, and turbines that filled the room. It looked less like a building and more like the engine room of a capsized ocean liner. Ahead, on the far side of the chamber, a movement flickered in the periphery of Thorne's vision. It was a shadow detaching itself from a cluster of hydraulic rams. The architect. He was moving with a desperate, fluid agility, leaping over a gap in the catwalk where the grating had rusted away. Behind him, his two remaining operatives struggled with the heavy waterproof bags, their movements slowed by the weight of the stolen data. Thorne raised his rifle, but he didn't fire. The backdrop was a maze of high-pressure steam pipes and electrical conduits. A stray bullet here wouldn't just kill a target. It could rupture a line and boil them all alive or electrify the catwalk. The environment was a loaded weapon pointed at everyone. The architect reached a control station, a heavy iron console studded with analog gauges and large, wheel-operated valves. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was trying to operate the machinery. He threw his weight against a massive red wheel, straining to turn it. The rust screamed in protest, a sound that cut through the roar of the water. "Move!" Thorne yelled, abandoning stealth. He sprinted along the catwalk, the metal rattling under his boots. The architect glanced back, his eyes locking with Thorne's across the 50-foot gap. There was no fear in that gaze, only a cold calculation of physics. The wheel turned. A heavy clank echoed through the chamber, followed by the hiss of hydraulic pressure releasing. Suddenly, the water below began to rise. It wasn't a slow creep, it was a surge. The intake valves had been fully opened. The chamber was designed to flood dry docks, and now it was flooding itself. The black water, swirling with debris and oil, lapped at the bottom of the catwalks, rising inches by the second. One of the operatives, panic overriding his discipline, dropped his bag and raised his carbine, firing a burst at the approaching police. The shot sparked harmlessly off the heavy steel stanchions near Thorne's head, but the noise was catastrophic in the enclosed space. Thorne dropped to a knee, returning fire with a single, disciplined shot. The operative jerked backward, his weapon clattering onto the grating, and tumbled over the rail into the rising black water. He was gone instantly, sucked under by the turbulence of the intake current. The architect didn't flinch. He grabbed the remaining bag from his other subordinate and shoved the man toward a ladder that led up to a maintenance hatch. It was a decoy move. As the operative began to climb, drawing the fire of the SWAT team, the architect vaulted over the railing of the control platform, not into the water, but onto the casing of a massive horizontal pipe running along the wall. Thorne watched in disbelief. The man was running along a wet, cylindrical pipe 2 feet wide, suspended over a maelstrom. He was heading toward the far wall, where a circular service hatch was stenciled with the words, "Emergency purge outflow." The water was now washing over Thorne's boots. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing his toes. "Fall back to the upper gantry," he ordered his team, but he didn't move back. He pushed forward, wading through shin-deep water on the catwalk, closing the distance to the pipe. The architect reached the purge hatch. It was sealed with a heavy locking mechanism designed to hold back the Atlantic Ocean. He didn't try to open it. Instead, he pulled a small, collapsed object from his tactical vest. A rebreather, a compact, military-grade diving apparatus. He shoved the mouthpiece between his teeth and secured the mask over his eyes. Then, he did the unthinkable. He reached for a lever next to the hatch marked gravity flush. Thorne realized what was happening a split second too late. "Brace!" he screamed. The architect pulled the lever. The circular hatch didn't open. Instead, the floor of the chamber beneath the water opened. The gravity flush was a fail-safe designed to empty the chamber into the river instantly in case of overpressure. The bottom dropped out of the world. The water in the room, millions of gallons of it, was sucked downward with the violence of a collapsing star. The suction was irresistible. Thorne grabbed a vertical stanchion, wrapping his arm around it as the current tore at his legs, trying to drag him into the abyss. The noise was a physical assault, a roaring vacuum that popped his ears. He watched as the architect, equipped with his rebreather, simply let go. He allowed the current to take him. He was swept off the pipe, a black shape tumbling into the vortex, clutching the waterproof bag of data against his chest like a child. He vanished into the dark throat of the outflow pipe, riding the flush out into the East River. Thorne held on for his life, his muscles screaming, the water hammering him against the steel. The level dropped rapidly, leaving him hanging from the stanchion, gasping for air in the sudden, dripping silence of the emptied chamber. He looked down. The outflow pipe was a black hole in the floor, leading directly to the riverbed. The architect was gone. He had flushed himself out like waste, escaping into the open water where no police cordon could hold him. Thorne dropped to the wet grating, coughing water from his lungs. His radio was waterlogged, crackling with static. He pulled it off and threw it into the mud. He walked to the edge of the abyss and looked down. He didn't see a villain escaping. He saw a trail. The outflow pipe emptied into the currents near the Williamsburg Bridge. It was a dangerous, rocky stretch of water, but it was also where the currents converged. Thorne stood up, water dripping from his coat. He wasn't done. The architect had played his ace the water, but water leaves a mark, and Thorne knew that no matter how good the swimmer, eventually, they have to come up for air. He climbed back up the spiral staircase, not with the frantic energy of the chase, but with the cold, hard resolve of the hunter who knows the prey is wounded. The architect was in the river now, and the river belonged to the city. The East River was not a passive body of water. It was a muscular, freezing beast of tidal currents and industrial runoff. For the architect, tumbling through the pitch-black void of the outflow pipe, the experience was akin to being digested by a leviathan. The water hammered against his rebreather mask, the pressure fluctuation threatening to rupture his eardrums. He was spinning blindly, a piece of debris in the city's plumbing, clutching the waterproof bag to his chest with a death grip. This was the most dangerous phase, the blind interval, but his calculations were absolute. According to the municipal blueprints from 1968 documents he had spent years acquiring, from the dusty archives of the Department of Public Works, this outflow pipe terminated 500 yards offshore, beneath the pilings of the Williamsburg Bridge. It was a straight shot into the deep channel, where the currents would carry him swiftly south to a prearranged rendezvous point near Red Hook. He envisioned the extraction, the surfacing, the flare, the silent boat, the champagne. He had humiliated the police, blinded the markets, and vanished into the ether. He was the ghost in the machine. But the darkness of the pipe seemed to stretch longer than the physics of the flow should allow. The turbulence, instead of dissipating into the open river, began to intensify, churning with a violent, mechanical rhythm. The architect felt a sudden, jarring impact against his shoulder, then another against his legs. He wasn't drifting. He was being funneled ahead. The crushing blackness was broken by a grid of harsh, sodium vapor light filtering down through turbulent water. He kicked his legs, expecting to breach the surface of the river, to see the gray sky and the Manhattan skyline. Instead, he hit a ceiling, a steel mesh ceiling. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his disciplined mind. He clawed at the mesh. It was rigid, immovable, coated in slime and algae. He looked around. He wasn't in the river. He was in a containment chamber, a vast concrete box filled with swirling, frothing water that smelled of chemical treatment and ozone. He had surfaced, but he was still inside, 30 feet above, standing on a rust-proof galvanized walkway that spanned the width of the East River Environmental Interceptor Facility. Detective Thorne looked down into the churning green water of the intake pool. He was not out of breath. He was not running. He was leaning against the railing, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, a habit he had quit 10 years ago and restarted 10 minutes ago. The facility was a cathedral of modern sanitation, a massive, brutalist structure built in 2015 to filter storm surge debris before it entered the river. It was the one thing the architect's 1968 blueprints didn't show. The city had changed. It had grown a new organ, a kidney to filter its blood, and the architect had flushed himself right into it. "Cut the turbines," Thorne said softly to the facility manager standing next to him. The manager, a bewildered man in a hard hat, pressed a button on his control panel. The deafening roar of the circulation pumps died down, replaced by the slapping sound of the water settling in the tank. Below, the water level began to drop as the intake was sealed. The architect, clinging to the underside of the debris screen, felt the water recede. He let go, dropping 4 feet onto a sloped concrete ledge, coughing water, his rebreather mask dangling from his neck. He looked up. The space was cavernous, echoing with the drip of filtered sludge, and there, high above him, framed by the industrial lights, was the silhouette of the detective. Thorne looked like a judge looking down from a very high bench. The architect froze. He looked at the walls. Smooth, slime-coated concrete, 30 feet high. No ladders. No exits. Just the intake pipe he had come from, now sealed, and the filtration screens above. He was a rat in a bucket, The blueprints, Thorne called down, his voice booming in the acoustic chamber. You used the Cold War archives. Sector 7 geology. Very thorough. The architect stood up slowly, wiping the slime from his face. He still held the bag. He regained his composure, straightening his wetsuit jacket, trying to summon the aura of the mastermind one last time. The city is a living thing, Thorne continued, flicking his cigarette ash into the void. It grows, it heals, it builds over its scars. You treated it like a static map. You thought you were walking through a museum, but you were walking through a construction zone. That outflow was diverted 10 years ago. The architect looked at the bag in his hand. The billions in cryptocurrency codes. The leverage. It doesn't matter. The architect shouted up, his voice raspy but defiant. The market has already crashed. The algorithm executed. The wealth transfer is complete. You have me, but you don't have the money. It's in the cloud. It's everywhere and nowhere. Thorne smiled, a tired, grim expression. You still don't get it. We didn't freeze the market to save the money. We froze it to trace the injection. Thorne held up his own phone. When you severed the cables, you created a vacuum. When you injected your sell orders, you were the only signal in the noise. The NSA didn't try to stop the crash. They used it as a contrast die. They watched exactly where the packets went. Every account, every shell company, every wallet you routed to, they're freezing them right now. You didn't rob the bank. You signed the guest book. The architect's face fell. The arrogance, the intellectual superiority, the mask of the untouchable genius, it all dissolved, leaving only a wet, shivering man in a sewer. He dropped the bag. It hit the wet concrete with a heavy, wet slap. It was useless now. Throw down a ladder. Thorne ordered the manager. The ladder descended with a mechanical whine. The architect didn't move at first. He looked at the dark intake pipe, then at the ladder. He had nowhere to go. The subterranean world he had tried to weaponize had turned on him, trapping him in its newest layer. As the architect began the slow, humiliating climb upward, Thorne turned away, walking toward the exit of the facility. The sun was setting outside, casting a bruised purple light over the city. The sirens were still wailing in the distance, a reminder of the chaos, but the heartbeat of the city was stabilizing. Thorne walked out onto the pier. He looked at the skyline of Manhattan across the river. The lights of the skyscrapers were flickering back on, block by block, as the grid reset. The city was wounded? Yes. It would bleed money for weeks. Heads would roll. Politics would be played. But the pulse was back. He took a deep breath of the cold, salty air. The architect had tried to find the hollow spaces in the city, the weaknesses, the forgotten tunnels. But he had forgotten the most important rule of the underground. Eventually, everything has to come to the surface. Thorne tossed his cigarette into the East River and watched it drift away. A tiny spark swallowed by the dark, indifferent water. Book him, Thorne said into his radio, his voice flat and final. And tell the mayor the trains will run in the morning.